my son Rob, either now or in the past in your life. And Rob is currently in a relationship with a young lady. We're very fond of her. And evidently her future nieces, we hope, are very fond of her. And so the other night we were down for the 4th of July and we're talking about I do something. Do y'all remember the old television show Rocky and Bullwinkle? How many of you remember that show? That was from John. That was from our era. Yeah, it was. And by the way, the last episode of Rocky and Bullwinkle was on July the 4th, 1964. So we were talking about. I used to love the episode or the part of that show that was called Fractured Fairy Tales. Do you remember those? Some of you are nodding. And Fractured Fairy Tales, it would be like Rapunzel or it'd be Sleeping Beauty, but they would be a little bit, just a little off. And so my granddaughters, they love that. They love for me to take off in all different tangents and directions. It's the one time I know when I'm preaching, I have a really good audience. So they're there and they're listening. And so Caroline is in the bed with us and she says, "Oh, I have a fairy tale and it's about a prince and a princess." And I said, "Okay, do you want to tell it?" She said, "Oh, yeah. So she said, "Y'all get quiet now. Y'all get still and get quiet." And so laying between us, her big eyes got real big, and we cut on the light on the iPhone so we could see her face. And she's telling the story. She said, "Once upon a time, there was a prince named," and I said, "Do you have a name?" She said, "No. I'm going to let you guess." She said, "But there was also a princess named Allison," she said. And I said, "Well, was the prince named Rob?" She said, that's it, Rob and Allison." So she's really excited about her uncle and his new friend. And so she goes on and she said, "And one day, Princess Allison went for a walk. And she met Prince," and Lynette said, "Rob." And she said, "Oh, yes, that's it. She met Prince Rob." And she said, "And then a long time later, Princess Allison went for another walk. But I can't talk about what happened on that walk, and then later they had Prince Robbie." I said, "Caroline, where did you get this idea?" She said, "I heard my mommy and my daddy talking about this." She said when they got together, they would have babies. And I said, "Well, they don't have to have babies." She said, "Oh, but they will because it's in my fairy tale," she said. One of the scriptures that we get so enamored with and we turn it into kind of a fairy tale is this particular scripture because it's pretty familiar. "Come to me, all ye who are heavy laden, and I will give you rest. Take my yoke upon you, for it is easy." I did some years ago. I had a college roommate who developed, at that time they didn't know what to call it, but later on they called it, in fact the Mayo Clinic has a term for it, it's called chronic fatigue syndrome. And here's the technical name. It is myalgic encephalomyelitis, or MECFS. It causes, according to the clinic, extreme fatigue that lasts for at least 6 months. Some of you may have experienced this. Symptoms worsen with physical or mental activity, but don't fully improve with rest. The case of chronic fatigue syndrome is totally unknown, although there are many theories. Most experts, including those at the Mayo Clinic, believe it may be triggered by a combination of factors. And the symptoms include extreme exhaustion, muscle or joint pain, unrefreshing sleep, and dizziness. And according to the CDC, and this was written, by the way, in 2018, between 1 million and 2.5 million people suffer with some form of it. Now, by the way, to make you even feel worse, during COVID, cases of this increased, some of you are not, increased drastically. And maybe that was the symptoms of COVID. Maybe it was the fact that we were shut in, but anyway. And those are pretty distressing statistics about a disease that we don't know what causes, and we're not real sure what the symptoms are, if they're indicating some other illness. So that's pretty bad news. If you have a disease and don't know what causes it, if you have symptoms, like I have tingling fingers and still haven't been able to figure out what's going on with that, it can be a little disconcerting. But when Jesus comes along and he says, come to me, all ye who are weary, whether you have NECFS or whether you're just tired or whether you're spiritually weary. And by the way, that can happen to us. I will give you rest. So it's a meme. It's a Facebook meme. It's a fairy tale. It's something that we can set our dreams about. We can look forward to. There's going to come a time when we're going to rest. We sang that old gospel song when I was in the 5th grade, going to lay down my burdens down by the riverside. Down by the riverside. My 5th grade music teacher was big on those old spirituals, and we sang it a lot. Chuck Swindoll, the preacher, said it this way: in place of our exhaustion and spiritual fatigue, God will give us rest. And all that he asks is that we come to him. That we spend time thinking about him, meditating on him, talking to him, listening to him, occupying ourselves with him, totally and thoroughly lost in the hiding place of his presence. I like that. And I've often heard sermons on this passage, and here's my issue, and it's my own issue. I went back and pulled up a couple of old sermons, one 25 years ago on this very passage in the lectionary, and I thought, that doesn't make sense. How can you get rest if you are taking a yoke upon you? How can you do that? Now, how many of you actually have ever seen a yoke, particularly of oxen? You ever seen that? Some of y'all are getting older. Y'all know what that looks like. We don't have much of that in the United States, and in fact, I had to go to the country of Ghana in Africa to see that firsthand. And I remember seeing it, and I remember seeing there was one ox on one side who was a little bit larger than the other ox. I guess they try to match up the oxes so they're the same size, or maybe that's where the yoke comes in. They have to shave off part of the wood or change the way it's hooked into the ox. But I saw this, and there was an older-looking oxen and a younger-looking oxen. And I asked our host, Dr. Forson, I said, they were in a field near his house, and he said, those are my neighbors. He said, he uses them to plow the field. I said, explain that to me a little bit, because I've never seen that. He said, you hook up a more experienced oxen with the younger oxen so that it will train. Am I onto something here? So that it will train that oxen how to do it, how to plow, how to keep a straight line. And so it will stay in line. So then it began to make sense. Jesus maybe wants us. Maybe we're weary because we can't plow in a straight line. Does that make sense? Maybe we're weary because we're kicking against the goats. And maybe we're trying to work against the person who is a part of our life. Oh, there's a good one. Or maybe this. Maybe we're just undisciplined in our life. Maybe that's what it is. Here's what I had to do. I had to go back and look at what Jesus is saying here and who he is saying it to. Now here's what's interesting. This is to the religious crowd. Let me say it in these terms. These are to the church folks. These are to the saved folks. This is not a message to people who are trying to find God. This is not a seeker group of people. This is not some guy who has never experienced the Jewish law. These were people who all, even his disciples, who knew the rules and the regulations, and can I say it, the weight of keeping the law. Now, all of you from Sunday school on learned this, that to get into salvation and to have heaven as your gift, and to be guaranteed that, you had to keep the law, and you had to keep it perfectly. Now, without saying that I'm not at times a perfectionist, I'm married to a perfectionist, and I know what a perfectionist looks like, and I know what it looks like when it's in full bore. I know what it feels like when it's running. And so I'm trying to think that to get into the presence of God, to get into the Holy of Holies, to have all of my sins forgiven, to be able to walk and talk and be in the presence of God as a good practicing Hebrew, I had to keep the law and I had to keep it perfectly. That's heavy. Too heavy. In fact, so heavy that not even the Jews could keep it. And so, hence, they had changes in the law. Remember, they started out with 10, and then by the time we get to Jesus, there are some 600 laws, 365 don'ts and 285 do's. That's just in the Scripture. And then there was the interpretation of the law. And then there was the preaching of the law. And all that was in little places and scrolls, and it was read in the synagogues and in the temple. And so you keep adding to that and adding to that and adding to that, so that literally by the time of Jesus there are so many that the only people who know them are a select group of people called the scribes to keep up with the law. And you had to go to the scribe and find out, am I keeping it all right? Am I doing it properly? And sometimes the priest would even give a certain absolution and say, you're okay, you get by on that one. It's sort of like that, you have to keep the Sabbath and keep it holy, but if you need to travel, there's a certain distance you can travel and be okay. It's heavy. It's mind-boggling when you think about it. We don't think about it because Jesus comes along and he's asked, what's the law? And he said, well, it's just two things. Love the Lord your God with all your heart, soul, mind, and strength. And what? Love your neighbor as yourself. That doesn't seem quite as heavy. But anyway, so there's this idea that Jesus says, lay down these burdens, all this stuff you're carrying, these traumas, these expectations. By the way, somebody said it this way, and I wish I could find the author of the quote, that the most difficult expectations to keep in life are those of your own to yourself. Helen Sawyer used to say it this way, the most difficult forgiveness is the forgiveness you have to find for yourself. It's heavy, too heavy. So Jesus says, come to me and I'll give you rest. And here's what I'll do. In exchange for all of the burdens of your life, for all the weight of your life, for all of the trauma of your life, for all of the missed expectations that you've put on yourself, for all the expectations that other people have put on you and placed on you all those years, guess what? Put all that aside and take my yoke. Now there's an interesting theory here, and it's just a theory, and I want to be careful when I say this. And especially preaching to a group of people who are going to read this and say, some scholars think possibly that Joseph was not a carpenter who made door frames all the time, although he made some of those, or he made wooden objects to help in the home, but that probably, most likely based on the description and the time and the history, that Joseph, Jesus' earthly dad, would have been in the business of making yokes. And that Jesus would have seen a yoke being made. And he would have seen it being measured. And he would see it how the yoke was made and then placed on the oxen or the cows and placed on them in such a way. And how maybe he needed to shave off a little of that because one cow was a little taller or one oxen a little taller. Or maybe that. And then he put it on there and he was constantly, by the way, a yoke is constantly being improved or degraded. Did you know why that is? Because constantly there's something putting pressure on. And likewise, if we're wearing a yoke, there's a constant pressure on us. Philip Brand wrote a book called Fearfully and Wonderfully Made. I really encourage you to read it sometime. It's sort of like the book that Susan bought for our Bible study group on the different diseases, none of these diseases. Brand was a surgeon, and he actually was in India for a long period of his life. And he said he worked as a surgeon mainly with leprosy patients, and he said he had always struggled. One day he was reading the passage, I will take my yoke upon you, for it is easy. And he began to think about yokes and what he did in India. He said he treated primarily the ulcers and the shortened fingers and the toes of the people who had leprosy. And he said, I had to work backwards, he wrote, to figure out what particular stress caused those tissues to break down. He said, I had hundreds of patients that had damaged their feet by wearing shoes or sandals that had a tiny rust spot. Y'all know about that, don't you? He said, step after step, that rust spot ground against the skin. Yet these patients' defective pain cells, because of the leprosy, that's what happens. The pain cells are defective. They don't read the pain and did not warn of danger. And so you can imagine over a long period of time wearing something rubbing against your skin, what would happen. And he said, to my surprise in studying these leprosy patients who had these terrible wounds, I learned that most of the damage did not come from massive sort of things. In other words, let me say it, go back to our sermon. yoke doesn't cause damage because all of a sudden somebody puts a plow to us and the first time we're injured. No, it's because of months and years and years and years of that yoke wearing against our skin. He said, to my surprise, I learned that the most serious damage came from small, repetitive stresses like this. Not more obvious stresses like bruises or cuts or burns. He said, any gentle stress, when applied to a single spot, repetitively, can literally destroy living tissue. You know about bed sores, don't you? If you've ever had to care for someone in bed for a long time. I remember working at Trinity Place, and I remember going into a meeting, and they said, we need to talk about bed sores today. And I thought, what's the big deal about that? And then I learned that bed sores could lead to all sorts of terrible, terrible infections, which eventually could lead to the resident's death. Brand makes the point, and I want to make it here, that if we're yoked to a yoke that is burdensome, and it wears, and it wears, and it wears, and if we have a weight upon us, or we have a problem in our lives, and it wears, and it wears, and it wears, it will eventually, let me quote Brand here, destroy life. This is some good stuff. It's not someone dumping everything at once on us, although that can be a tremendous trauma. In trauma studies, it's not the big T of a death or a loss, so that can be something that stays with us a while. It's how we then interpret and live with that loss or that pain. But he says, Brand says, it's the rubbing constantly, repetitively, that destroys the fingers and the cells and the arms of these lepers. And he said, in fact, he said, I think that if you put a flat, uncarved piece of wood on an ox neck and use it to pull a cart, very quickly sores will break out on that ox and he'll be useless. A good yoke must be formed to the shape of the ox's neck. It should cover a large area of skin to distribute the stresses widely. It should be smooth, rounded, and polished, no sharp edges, so that no one point will endure unduly high stress. If I succeed in doing it right, he says, I can make the yoke fit snugly around the ox's neck and cause him no discomfort. And he can haul heavy loads every day of his life for years. And he will remain perfectly clean with his skin with no pressure sores. Now I know what Jesus is doing. I read this. Jesus is saying that what we put on ourselves in our lives is uneven or unpolished. Or let's say this, it's sinful. Or let's say this, it's the wrong fit. Or it's so heavy and burdensome that it's weighed down that wood into our skin. And so we begin to develop sores and we begin to be very sore and very injured and very hurting people. And pretty soon, just any slight pressure from any kind of circumstance will cause us to go, ouch. Now, I'm not speaking literally here. You know that. So Jesus says, come to me, all ye who are heavy laden. And let's open that wide open. What might that mean? Because yoke, it sounds like, that Jesus puts upon is one that's uniquely made for us. And our problem is not that we're not going to be yoked in life, and not that we're going to have pressures in life, and not that we're going to have burdens in life, and not that we're going to have times in our life where we're going to have to carry the load. Can I say this? But we're wearing the wrong yoke. And Jesus says, take my yoke upon you, for the burden is light. And what is Jesus' burden? What is it exactly? Well, first of all, it is of his own design. I used to hear that phrase, and I used to rebel against it. I don't know. You've heard this phrase that God has a plan for your life. And I know that phrase has been abused and misused by preachers and evangelists and all of that. But can I tell you something? If I believe, as I do, in a providential God who has power and who is personally involved in my life because he created me and fearfully and wonderfully, as Brand says in his book, I'm made, and that he loves me, and that his grace is persistent and consistent in my life. Guess what? Why wouldn't I believe that God has a plan and a template and a pattern? So yes, his yoke will fit. And unfortunately, because of the burdens of life and the twists and turns of the trail of pulling the carts of life and all the weights of life that fall into our life and that we have to carry, and sometimes because of the companions we walk along with, can I say it, in life, we can get bruised and battered and sore and heavy laden, and we need rest. And Jesus says, come to me, and I'll fit you with what was intended for you. Sometimes in the church, and this is where I want to speak to the church today, and to us particularly, and I want to be careful how I do this, because as we said in the Bible study Wednesday, there are rules and regulations in every church, and every church has a different set. Some have more, some books of order or books of discipline are greater, some are smaller, some are non-existent, but they still have rules. My friend Hubert Johnson, when I went with him to the Pentecostal church where his mother wore the high big bun, you know, she had a bun so tall that she had pins sticking out of it, like they were holding her hair in place. And he said, oh, we don't have any rules or order of worship here. And he said, we just let the Spirit flow, and more the Spirit flowed. It was interesting. I went back with him several weeks later, and it was exactly the same order as it had been before. So we all have rules and regulations. The problem becomes, and to the people Jesus is speaking to, the religious people who had put weights and burdens. He even told them what time you do this. Or they put weights and burdens on themselves. And he said to them, he said, that's death. It'll wear you out. It'll make you sore. It'll get you tired. I don't know, it's been now, it doesn't seem possible, but it's been almost 30-something years ago. I served a church. And there was a lady in the church who was a wonderful lady. She would write me long letters thanking me for my sermons. And by the way, don't even you start doing that. If you like it, just say you like it. If you don't, say this is not plan. And she filled it up with all sorts of little glitter. She was a glitter person. And, you know, the other day, Ellie, for the 4th of July, their mama had put stars and little fireworks things on their side of their faces. And I said, and she said, Pop, you don't like that. I said, I've never been a glitter fan. But she'd write me these letters, and she constantly was saying, and she said, but in your sermon you said, and I called her one day, and I said, I'll just use a nickname. Her name was Teresa, and I said, Teresa, come by my office. Let's talk. You just everything seemed to be adding another burden to my sermon. In other words, you didn't quite measure up, and you didn't quite do that. And then in one of her letters, she wrote me, she said, we've got to be perfect as our Father in heaven is perfect. And so I called her, and we visited, and she began to tell me her story about her dad, who had been a golf pro of all things. And so I thought, I'd like to meet him. He's a golf pro. In fact, he was a golf pro of one of the local courses. And he said, I'm sure my dad would be glad to give you a lesson. And so anyway, and she said, that's part of my problem. She said, my dad was an alcoholic. And so all the wonderful accolades that people give to him, to me, it just weighed me down. It was just too heavy for me, and I rebelled against that. So I said, maybe I could go see your dad. He happened to have an illness at the time that was going to eventually take his life, and so I arranged to go see him. I had to meet up with him literally on the golf course. I met him at the driving range, and he stood hitting balls, and we talked for about 30 minutes. And then he said, that'll be another $30. And I said, well, I think the pastoral visit is over. When you get charged for doing your own visiting, you're in trouble. But here's what I learned in that thing. He had a terrible childhood. He had an awful burden. And so the alcohol was an escape. It was a medication. It was a way to get away from that. And see, what had happened to his daughter, like a lot of children of alcoholics, she had chosen the rigid route. She had chosen the perfect route. She had chosen the burdensome route. Called her back, and we met again, and She again wrote me a 16-page letter right before the meeting to tell me what the meeting would be about and what the structure of the meeting would be. And I'm thinking, oh boy. And so I just walked in and I said to her, Teresa, I said, can you just lay some of this aside? I said, can I speak frankly? She said, your dad is going to meetings and he's off alcohol and he seems really unburdened. But you seem very burdened. And you seem like you want to pass that on to everybody. And she began to apologize. Oh, no. And then she began to do that self-effacing thing where she was saying, oh, I shouldn't do that. And I said, no, just stop. I said, take the yoke of Jesus upon you, not the yoke of Teresa or of your dad or of his parents. You see, the Jews believed in that sort of thing. Sin and burdens to the third and fourth generation. But here's what Jesus does. Jesus' yoke breaks the pattern and the template of the everyday religious yoke that we've worn all our lives, and it takes it off of us, and he puts on a uniquely just made for you specifically. I remember the first time that Jim Davis in Columbus called me up, and I'd gotten a coat off the rack at Jim's Clothing, and Jim played football at Mississippi State. Jim was a good friend. Jim said, hey, listen, he said, you're just at an odd size right now. He said, your belly's growing faster than your heart. I said, well, Jim, what do we do about that? He said, I can get you a coat and I can get the guy and we can fit you. It'll be perfect. And you know what was interesting? I've been wearing jackets up to that time and I would do this and the sleeves were too long. Y'all know. Y'all have seen preachers with that. The pants were too long and the waist was too tight. And so he said, I can fix you up. He got in, brought his guy, measured me, and I'm telling you, when he put those dress pants and that coat on me, I wore it for 20 years. It was perfect. It fit me like a glove. I'd put it on. I'd sometimes forget I had it on after church and wear it out to eat or even get back to the house and be sitting on the couch and I said, well, okay, the guy said, it just feels nice. It feels good. Here's the yoke that many of us wear in the church. Ought. Got to. Mama did it that way. Daddy did it that way. We've always done it that way. And can I tell you something? If we wear that long enough, it'll put pressure on us and it'll wear us down and it'll rub the life right out of us. And Jesus says, take my yoke. It's fitted for you. It's smooth. It's designed for you. It's my plan for your life. I can't say it that many of us suffer from spiritual fatigue syndrome. Preachers do it, by the way. If you don't think so, look at all of them that are retiring early. Lay people suffer, deacons suffer, elders suffer from it, older people, younger people. In fact, when a survey was done by the Barna firm years ago, they said that one of the things that young people resisted in the church was not so much the hypocrisy, but the fact that they immediately wanted to put people to work. That spiritual life became just another form of life and work and wearing down and heavy and burdened and some heavy laden, too heavy. I remember that I told Teresa that day, and by the way, we stayed friends, although I don't think she quite got it, but her dad did. Her dad wrote me, by the way, a one-page note just for 2 words, thank you. Isn't that not neat? And he never said, thank you for coming to meet me at my baby wick. He just said, thank you. And he never said what I did for him. He just said, thank you. And that was enough. So if you're walking around today, whatever the yoke might be, whether it was the expectations of others, the expectations, by the way, which are terribly heavy of yourself, on yourself, know that Jesus has a yoke that you can wear and will not take the life out of you, will not burden you so much that you'll wear out and grow weary with well-doing. I've experienced it. And it's hard because it's not what I was raised with. I was raised with 2 grandmothers on either end of the spectrum. Alt. And if you didn't do the alt, you shouldn't have done that. It's heavy. It can weigh you down. Too heavy. Jesus has a yoke. We all have a yoke. And it's a matter of whether we'll exchange the yoke of burdensome, heavy rules and expectations that we put on ourselves and that others have put on us, and the traumas that have fallen on us through all our lives, and the things that have just accidentally out of nowhere come into our life, and losses that have occurred, and pains that have been endured. And at some point in time, when Jesus says to you, my yoke is easy, you'll believe it. And you'll take it on. Let's pray. We do have an opportunity today to let go of some things, to take off that yoke that's worn us down to the nose, that's wounded us maybe even, or maybe has created so much injury that we don't want to think about putting another yoke back on. But Jesus says, take mine, it's made for you, it's fitted for you. Help us do that today, Lord. Help us to do that. We ask in the name of the one who teaches us to pray, saying, Our Father, who art in heaven, hallowed be thy name. Thy kingdom come, thy will be done, on earth as it is in heaven. Give us this day our daily bread, and forgive us our debts, as we forgive our debtors. And lead us not into temptation, but deliver us from evil. For thine is the kingdom, and the power, and the glory forever. Amen and amen. Several of you have mentioned to me, and so I'm going to, in just a minute, I'm going to cut off the camera for communion. Some of you mentioned you didn't necessarily not want to be on camera, you just thought maybe to get us. So we're going to cut that off, but as the choir sings, they're going to share music with us. And as they do that, I'm going to prepare the table. Charles, you come and we'll pull back, or whoever else is designated to do that. And then we'll join together and share the Lord's Supper.